Welcome to the first edition of Peau de Chagrin podcast. Today we are joined by John Marchant, gallerist of the John Marchant Gallery, as well as Peau de Chagrin founders Sophie Guerrero and Mesh Chiba.
And I'm Lucy Tesco. So, Mesh and Sophie, why Peau de Chagrin?
I'd been working in fashion for over 20 years and I had become slightly disillusioned. And I'd felt that I wanted to work on a project that focused on things that are beautifully made by artisans. And I mentioned this to my friend Sophie, and she mentioned a particular book to me that she thought was very pertinent.
La Peau de Chagrin. And as a young French girl, I read the Peau de Chagrin because everybody reads the Peau de Chagrin in France. And I've always been taken by this book and by what it represents as an existential search. I like that. I thought about it also because I've always been engaging in art, and I've always liked craft. I think there's art and there's craft, and great artists are often great craftsmen. Not always, but often. And I thought that if we would be able to work again with craftsmen and work with good materials and rescue some traditions, we would be able to make beautiful objects.
It does seem that craftsmanship is the perfect balm to the rampant consumerism that we seem to engage and embrace. This idea that actually you're going to value something because it's been made beautifully by someone who has taken time to make it, and it will last. There is a beauty in that. Be it a handbag, be it a scarf, be it a book. It can be any object, but it's something that's been made with real craftsmanship. And it's not about making something quickly because it has to be sold in a month's time or 2 months' time.
And consumed and thrown away.
These are we want to make things that people will cherish for a very long time and hand down from generation to generation. And the book that Sophie introduced to me, Peau de Chagrin, seems to discuss a lot of these issues. It can be an allegory, it's a fable, it's whatever way you want to look at it. But Balzac talks about a lot of these issues in his novel that seem to resonate with both me and Sophie.
And it's this idea to try, it's a funny idea to try to make things that can be out of time, not bound by time, therefore not obsolete. I don't like the idea of obsolescence. I'm a woman.
We have a website called peaudechagrin.com.
And we only sell online.
So let's start by discussing time in this book. It's quite a bold theme that runs throughout. Very Balzacian, if I can use that term, as I think it echoes very much his life as much as it does Raphael's in the book. We are constantly reminded of the elusiveness of time. It's escaping us, and this is ever more crystallised by the very object that the whole book is about, the Chagrin that's constantly shrinking and is reificating, if you will, exactly what's happening with this elasticity of time that's shrinking in front of us all. Don't know if that was a theme that you picked up on massively, John, when you were reading the book.
Well, I guess I took the skin to be a kind of reflection of our own human form, really, isn't it? So we're destined for decay and death. I mean, actually, as the book progresses, we find, well, we're given the idea that only nature is constant. So, you know, how life is constantly slipping through our fingers, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Nothing at all.
Yeah.
Whatever the protagonist, Raphael tries to do, there's nothing. Actually, in many ways, although the Chagrin is a central part of the book. You could actually take it out completely. It's only a minor construct in the book, actually, and the same thing would happen to Raphael. He's still going to die, as we all are.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of cutting to the quick of it, aren't we? Which kind of comes hand in hand, really, that from the very offset, the theme of time and the notion of death is sort of put upon us from the very beginning. Obviously, the kind of scene in the casino, very morbid, kind of gormless characters, and moving straight into an attempt at suicide. It's really setting us up for what we're ultimately going to be fighting against for the rest of the book.
I mean, and also this sense of his absolute need to be acknowledged. Raphael, he has to be acknowledged now. He's in a race to be acknowledged, and he can't. He can't wait. He's in a rush. He's in a constant rush.
Do you think he's rushing to be acknowledged mostly so that he can then transcend time? Is it to try and put a stamp on the shortness of his life that will then kind of transcend it, and ultimately, he will escape death in some form or another?
Yeah, I think it's this idea of this sort of to be acknowledged is to some way transcend the inevitable, but it's still going to get you in the end.
I think it's we see it in our own contemporary culture. This need to be someone is pervasive, and it's supposed to have value to it. And if you are someone, then your life will always stand for something. But of course, that's not true either. And ever it was thus. And it's ironic, actually, isn't it, that in writing this novel about someone that's trying to get recognised, Balzac himself gets recognised, and he gets elevated to a society which he then tries to pick apart. It's a funny role reversal, but of course, as with many novels, as we all know, it's in many senses a self-portrait of Balzac himself.
Absolutely, I think this echoes Balzac's life, if anything, from every facet of the time. This kind of constant suppression and repression of emotion, and kind of in that constant awareness of the other at all times, kind of reflects as much Balzac's desire to elevate himself above it as much as it does all the kind of pressures that are on him coming from where he does. Also the Catholicism in his life, I think it's that kind of weight. I think Raphael's character feels like a very suppressed sort of young Jesuit boy, sort of trying to live this life that ultimately shouldn't be constricted by time, because with the religious element of kind of time is but your physical experience, it is Balzac in quintessence.
But it's also because at the beginning of the story we have a young person who is disillusioned and has decided to commit suicide. So at the beginning of the story, his life ends. Mm. So he's en sursis, he's suspended in time, he just goes into the antiquarian shop to kill time until night falls so that he can commit suicide, and whilst killing time, gets sucked into the time machine that this shop is, because it's really elasticized time and becomes something plastic and like a sculpture that takes you in all time. So for, 30 pages, 25 pages, you go through times, from Egyptian time until
the Renaissance.
Exactly. And then in the second part, in the third part of the story, which goes back to the time frame, the chronological time frame, he fights time. So one of the ways he fights time is by not wishing anything, but also he's already dead. So time has stopped, and he's forever fighting with something that he has already ended, That's what I find really interesting. It's this elasticity.
Yeah. It's a constant fight, really. He's fighting a losing battle from the beginning, and it is that sense of, from the very start, there's this flat, limp person, and you never sort of feel like he actually becomes anything. He's still this flat, limp person, whether he's pursuing Fedora, whether he is enjoying Pauline. He just sort of limps through time rather pathetically.
He's prolonging the inevitable. We know what where the end will be.
He's a dead man.
And it's that awkward in-between purgatory that sort of fills the void between his botched attempt at the start and what inevitably happens at the end in far more fanfare, obviously, than just throwing yourself off a bridge.
But then he also enters into this period of debauch, doesn't he? Which it gets. I think it says war, power, art, like debauch, are all forms of demoralisation, and there's this whole section of the book where they're kind of standing up for debauchery, like we've got to do this is fun, and this is where we're going to kind of elevate our minds, and it's something which we all have done many times, I'm sure, over and over again, but like overdoing it.
I'm not sure about that.
I'm sure maybe once or twice, Sophie. And what are we looking for? When we're trying to,
an art of living,
perhaps, or a little step into death, perhaps as well.
I sort of wonder. I feel as though that whole passage where the debauchery is sort of discussed and everybody's sort of going for it and rooting for it, Raphael's character sort of takes a step back and he doesn't feel so important there. And I sort of wonder if that was actually a trick of Balzac's in order to greater heighten the ultimate end as the true debauchery of all-consuming desire, which ultimately ends his life. Perhaps there was a reason. I didn't find, when I was reading the book, that passage, to me, I didn't feel Raphael very present in it.
No, he wasn't engaged. He was observing it, or he was not even observing it. He was there.
I think he certainly takes part, but Balzac fails to really... So one thing this book certainly isn't short of is descriptive passages, and there's definitely some lacking there, shall we say.
Maybe he shows an alternative, and maybe the debauchery, because it's so beautifully written, it's fabulously written, shows an art of living, a proposition. Like Pauline is another proposition of living. You might like it or not, or Fedora is another proposition of living. But those different characters, Aquilina and Euphrasia, offer different ways of living and actually engaging with life, which Raphael doesn't. Raphael wants to be recognized, and that's all. And whilst trying to be recognized, he's never living.
No, he's too concerned with being recognized. He's too concerned with his status. He's too concerned with the way he is perceived that he doesn't achieve anything.
It sounds horribly familiar to where we are today, doesn't it? The constant flipping Facebook updates and people not actually going out and enjoying themselves. Instagram, stuff like that. Maybe it's just a reflection of things that haven't really changed. Raphael does say actually in that period, he says, perhaps the thought of infinity dwells in these precipices. Perhaps they contain some colossal flattery for the soul of man, for is he not then wholly absorbed in himself? So when he's chasing this debauch, it's what is he really looking for? It's an interesting passage. It's an interesting passage,
but it's also interesting the way that his the book starts off. We know that he is planning to commit suicide, and he goes into the antique shop, and then you have the flashback to his life. But you know where it's going to lead. It's going to lead to this place in the antique shop.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
an interesting structure.
I find it's just sort of funny that when we go back to that passage which leads up to all of this, what the piece of work that Raphael spends all these years writing is called the Treatise of the Will.
So where do the three French verbs take us then, the vouloir, pouvoir and savoir? into the book?
Well, the vouloir is the volonté, the ever-present will, and you can't suppress that. The pouvoir, I think, is the power to either suppress or indulge your will. And savoir is, I think, something that is also incredibly present, and it's that argument that I think is quite central to this, is which life do you lead?
Actually, you can take this Buddhist approach to the book, can't you?
Totally.
This whole thing about, this constant cycle of ignorance, of ignorant liking and disliking things, and trying to break out of this cycle can possibly save you. But because we're faulty, because we're born as human beings, we are faulty in that respect, and we're constantly chasing this unattainable thing, we're going to die. That's what's going to kill us.
But it's interesting that Raphael, the one thing that Raphael can do is to curse the man who essentially he feels cursed by.
I don't. I think this is the crux of the argument that the book in play, personified by these two characters who in that moment, Raphael has sort of lived what he felt was a life of knowledge, and he was poor and he was desiring Fedora, who was the life of luxury and desire, and he is now deflated, feeling that he's failed at knowledge, he's failed at the fun life of following one's will. And here he comes head to head with somebody who feels completely complete and flourished in that life of knowledge. And it's one clashing with the other in this mad antique shop, and one pitying the poor fool who wills a life of luxury. I think there's a real innate cynicism at the core of Raphael at the beginning, which is very, what we were talking about when we were discussing disillusionment and deflatedness at the start of this book. He is purely cynical. I don't think he believes, in as much as probably a reader at the time believed that Balzac was writing a form of a fairy tale. No one was going to believe that this Chagrin actually had any power.
Can I change the subject very slightly and bring in something very, very simple? It's kind of simplistic, but that's actually very, very relevant. What would we say is the good translation of chagrin?
Chagrin.
Yes. Sorrow.
The skin of sorrow.
The skin of sorrow, right. Sorrow, vexation, maybe, a yearning, perhaps?
No, it's
just straight sorrow. Deep sorrow.
It's sorrow.
Right, so that skin of sorrow, maybe this is, again, a reflection of this thing that this is our human condition. I don't know if it's true, actually, but I'd like to think it's true. At the end of his life, Sigmund Freud was very interested in this book.
Was he?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
That makes sense.
I'm glad.
Yeah, because he believed his world was shrinking a little bit like the talisman. And he decided to commit suicide. I don't know if maybe you know that as well. But he'd resolved to commit suicide. And then he read Peau de Chagrin and said to his doctor, "This was the proper book for me to read. It deals with shrinking and starvation." And the next day, his doctor gave him the lethal dose, and he died. And one other little thing about the Chagrin itself, which is I found very interesting, also a little finger tapping over this thing, was that this particular Chagrin is supposed to be made from a wild ass. Persian wild ass is one of the very few animals in that family that's never been domesticated. So in some ways you could also say that the wild ass represents the will, because it's something you could never suppress it entirely.
Absolutely.
You can't saddle it. You can't saddle the will. However much you try with this thing, you can't do it.
Well, and it's that wonderful passage when he's kind of reunited with Pauline, they're in love, and he really wants to embrace life again, and he turns to science to try and solve this mad situation he's found himself in. And there's that wonderful passage where he speaks to the zoologist about the wild ass, and it's the embodiment of the will. It's exactly that.
And going to the science aspect of the story, it draws so many parallels to our world today, where we live in a world of such excessive consumption, and we think, and we know where it's leading us to, and we think that science will save us, that we won't have to change the way we desire or how much we desire, because science will come to our rescue and will save us from our own folly. And in the book it proves to be false. Science will not save us, will save Raphael. And I just draw so many parallels to our plight today.
I love the way actually after that he retreats to nature though, and he seems to find a cure in nature, which is that's.
But it's all
that's
too late.
Thing. It is too late. You're absolutely right. But he does. There is actually it's beautifully written, that whole passage actually, isn't it? Where he finds this little idyll outside the. Ace.
And there he doesn't fight time, because in the rest of the book, the places where time is boundless are always closed spaces. They're very contrived spaces. So we have the antiquarian shop, which is a monument of literature, I think, and time travel. And then we have the banquet, the orgy, which also, by its nature, is a totally closed space where you lose sense of time in debauchery, which is one of the ways to lose your time or to be in time if you're in the moment. If you're a Buddhist, you enjoy it, becomes an art form if you're good enough. And then there's his house, and his house is a monument that he builds, a futile monument that he builds.
His house feels like a mausoleum.